may have. And Catalina from the association is with us today, and she can assist you with any technical problems that you may have. Also, feel free to use the raised hand feature for questions or comments. It is located in the Participants tab at the bottom of your screen. For today's training, questions will be taken throughout the training. Attendees will be muted and unmuted by the host. If you wish to be unmuted, you must raise your hand, and then we will work to unmute you. You'll see a dialog box pop up asking that the host wishes to unmute you, and you need to click on that button. Since this is a 90-minute training, we will not be taking a break. And if you do have any issues, especially if the chat feature isn't available to you, feel free to email us at info@capapgpc.org. Our learning objective for today is to help professionals better understand criteria and concepts relating to a determination of grave disability in individuals. This training provides basic training regarding the topic. Any information and/or suggestions reviewed in the training is not to be construed as legal advice. Please consult with your administration and legal counsel regarding your county's programs, policies, and procedures. At this time, I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker, excuse me, Dr. Elizabeth Bromley is a psychiatric and medical anthropologist. She is associate professor in residence in the departments of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences and anthropology at UCLA. Dr. Bromley is the director of the UCLA DMH Public Mental Health Partnership, which provides training and implementation support to public mental health clinic teams that serve individuals with severe mental illness. Between 2004 and 2018, she was medical director for the Greater Los Angeles VA Mental Health Intensive Case Management Program. Her research is focused on the beliefs and concepts that underlie caregiving practices and the extent to which they match therapeutic action to patient experience. So at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Bromley.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hoping you can see me and hear me. That would be ideal, very helpful for the training. Quite pleased to be with you this afternoon. Hoping we have a fun time together. Little bit of newness and difference in your day is my hope. You should be able to now see my slides. And I'll be watching the chat as I go. So feel free to post questions there. Alert me if there's some issues you want to discuss. Let me just introduce this topic by giving you a bit of a background on who I am and what I'm doing in the Public Mental Health Partnership. I'm a psychiatrist. I've been in LA since 2003, and I'm a health services researcher. I use primarily qualitative methods, and my clinical work has always focused on assertive community treatment. So at the VA, for instance, I work on a multidisciplinary team. We work with individuals with severe mental illness. We often utilize inpatient hospital stays. We sometimes utilize LPS conservatorship in that clinical program. And in 2018, I began working with the LA County Department of Mental Health as a part of this contract, the Public Mental Health Partnership. And we support two programs in LA County DMH. One is the Full Service Partnership Program, which many of you know about, FSP, a very large program in LA County. We support FSP with training and also technical assistance, help them to improve the quality of care and adopt best practices. And we've also been working with the HOME team. HOME in LA County is a specialized mental health homeless outreach team. They work with primarily unsheltered individuals with severe mental illness whose mental illness seems to be impairing their ability to accept services, including shelter, including a decision to come indoors. And the HOME teams work specifically to evaluate and treat those individuals on the street or as they move indoors and into housing. And this training, the concept of grave disability has proven to be very important to their homeless outreach work. Some of the content you'll see in my training does have most relevance to unsheltered individuals, but the concepts and the principles will apply to any circumstance where we're considering grave disability. And I'll sort of give you a little bit of a heads up when I begin to talk about things that we see commonly among unsheltered populations. And I would welcome your questions about how those apply in other contexts. Really a collaborative effort, this training and others as well. And I'm so grateful to my collaborators on my team and also at LA County DMH for helping us to put together this content. And I'll pause periodically and welcome your questions. You can, I agree, using the hand raising function is a great way to signal that you'd like me to pause, but I'll do that periodically through the training as well. You all are experts on this content in your own way, and so it would be wonderful to hear your questions, thoughts, comments, controversies, issues that are relevant to your work. So my talk is going to center on this definition of grave disability, a condition in which a person, as a result of a mental disorder, is unable to provide for his or her basic personal needs for food, clothing, or shelter. We'll return to this several times. What I'd like to do is remind us all of the historical, the legal, the ethical context for concepts of grave disability. They help us to contextualize what it means, how we might utilize it in practice, how to think about it. And this is a very, very simple schematic of the development of mental health systems, mental health laws across the country, across the 20th century. And it really is the case, still the case in many countries, that were there a decision to be made about having an individual hospitalized for a mental illness, it used to be that really it was the family that would primarily make that decision with the collaboration of a doctor. That family or those doctors really could choose when an individual would be hospitalized for mental illness. And those same groups, family, doctors, made determinations about how long an individual would stay in a hospital, including a locked setting. And that really in California was the case up and through the LPS Act in 1968. Part of this began to change when we move into the era of deinstitutionalization, which we could mark in the early 60s, beginning in earnest. The Community Mental Health Centers Act, a federal act that intended to fund community mental health centers, was an acknowledgement that there was an effort to move individuals with severe mental illness out of institutional settings and into the community and to deliver their treatment to them in outpatient centers. As we're all aware, that Community Mental Health Center Act never quite lived up to its promise, but the intention was to build a robust outpatient mental health system that could replace the need for institutionalization. The passage of Medicaid, of course, made a big difference in how states understood and what was available to them in terms of funding for mental health institutions. And it accelerated deinstitutionalization, probably more than anything else. And it was in this context of deinstitutionalization that the Langeman-Petra Short Act of 1968 was passed in California. 1968, 1969 is when we began to work under our LPS laws through the LPS Act. And the act itself was intended to help support the expansion of the system of community-based mental health centers, provided some funding for it as well, with an aim to ensure the delivery of timely and appropriate support to those who needed it. And the LPS Act put in place the provision of conservatorship that were intended to allow another individual or entity to act on the person's behalf and to protect his or her interest when he or she's unable to care for himself. Those of you who have taken a look at the LPS Act, you'll be impressed with the work, the high quality scholarly work that went into conceptualizing what the LPS Act was trying to do. These 6 boxes that I have here on the right of the screen are all factors identified within the LPS Act itself as its intended effect. So one was to end inappropriate institutionalization, to replace the system by which a family or a set of doctors could decide for an individual how long they needed to be in the hospital. It also was intended to reduce public safety, reduce public costs, and improve public safety to attend to what was understood to be concerns for the public around cost and management of individuals with mental illness. It was also intended to allow for prompt evaluation and individualized treatment, to provide a mechanism by which those individuals who did not have family support, who did not have a doctor who was seeing them, could nonetheless be evaluated promptly. And the aim of all of the LPS statutes was to ensure that people were managed in the least restrictive environment. So if they don't need to be in a long stay institution for a considerable period of time, let's move them, allow them to move into a less restrictive environment. Of course, the LPS Act was also important for safeguarding rights, for ensuring better protection, better due process for individuals with severe mental illness. And there was an intent in the law as well that acknowledged that individuals with severe mental illness were often victims of crime. And so the LPS Act was intended to help ensure that there were protections for this vulnerable population. Now, critical to the concept of grave disability, and particularly when we're thinking about it clinically, not in a legal context, but in a clinical context, there are ethical underpinnings to decision-making about grave disability that really guide all that we do for individuals in a clinical setting. And the 2 ethical principles that are critical to grave disability decision-making are autonomy and beneficence. Autonomy, very simply, is the right to self-determination, the right for an individual to make his or her own choices for him or herself. And beneficence is very simply the desire to do good, to deliver something good, to deliver something that has benefits for the individual that you're working with clinically. And in grave disability decision-making, we're going to weigh these 2 obligations. I'm speaking as a clinician, but I think we would say this is sort of a fundamental principle for anyone who's working in human services with individuals with severe mental illness. We both want to support their right to make their own choices and also support their right to receive good care, to receive something good from us. That's why we do this. That is a fundamental moral principle of our work. And both of those are really critical in most every decision that we make. Now, one of the things we sometimes confront is a tension between beneficence and autonomy, a tension between what might drive me to do something good for someone and what might drive me to protect his or her right to self-determination. Those things, they often go together in a decision for clients. We're often able to do both. I'm both going to support the individual's right of choice, and I'm also going to give them something good. But there are rare circumstances in which beneficence and autonomy are in tension, and they move you in 2 different directions. And this neglect, overprotect continuum is one way we conceptualize, think about the instances in which beneficence and autonomy are in tension. And on the right side of this continuum is the overprotective end. Overprotection would be theoretically a circumstance in which we're prioritizing beneficence, we're prioritizing doing something good for an individual, something good that I myself have defined as good, right? If we're doing good for someone else, that's a thing that I myself have made a determination about. But there are many instances with a client where we feel we understand what's good for this person or what we want for them. And this overprotect end of this continuum prioritizes beneficence, that idea of doing something good for the client. We can get her to do the right thing. Let's arrange things for her so she has to do it the safest way. That's just an example of the sort of thought that we might have if we're a little bit on this end of the continuum. And in a circumstance like that, we may be overemphasizing beneficence and underemphasizing autonomy. We might not have enough space in that decision for the individual to make his or her own choices. So that's a representation of that extreme. That's the extreme we aim to avoid, of course. On the other extreme, the other end of the spectrum, is a circumstance where we are fundamentally oriented around autonomy. We are always protecting the autonomy of the individual. And it's extreme, that can result in neglect. And the idea here is if the individual is not choosing the safe thing, what we are compelled to do ethically is to protect that person's autonomy and their right to make their own choices for themselves. And this can, in the extreme, result in neglect. It's her choice. We're supposed to support her choice, let her do what she wants, is an example of the thing one might think in that circumstance. And we may be over prioritizing autonomy and underemphasizing beneficence. There may be something that individual needs to move toward a better space, and we may not be attending to that quite enough. So what we do as clinicians and as individuals working on behalf of someone else, in any kind of fiduciary relationship with them, we want to be somewhere in the middle or notice how we might be moving along this continuum sometimes. We might end up feeling a little bit like we want to be overprotective. It's good to notice that and raise some questions for ourselves about that. And then maybe question whether we should move to a slightly different space on this continuum. So that's this representation of this tension of autonomy and beneficence that sometimes comes up for us. One of the things that is very clear in the LPS Act is the importance of autonomy, that we as a society and as public servants, we do prioritize autonomy. We think autonomy is a very important good to protect for our clients. And you see that in the LPS Act because it very carefully defines when autonomy can be limited and for how long and under what circumstances. And the determination in the LPS Act relates to mental illness, symptoms of a mental illness. And it argues that in certain circumstances, in the presence of certain kinds of manifestations of mental illness, beneficence may need to be valued above autonomy for a limited period of time. So there are actually a rare number of circumstances in medicine where we limit autonomy in order to help a person manage their health or to do something that we've defined as good for them. Grave disability is one of them. There's also a concept in medicine of decision-making capacity. So someone who lacks decision-making capacity, for instance, may not be able to choose a life-saving treatment. And so there are legal structures, there are procedural structures in place to evaluate for decision-making capacity, for instance, in an emergency room or a hospital setting, evaluate decision-making capacity around a very specific treatment intervention, and where it's absent decision-making capacity, to put in place some other means of making complex medical choices for an individual that would limit their autonomy. And then there's a third circumstance, many of you are aware as well, incompetence, which is really entirely different concept than these other two. Incompetence is a kind of inability to make decisions that would be longstanding and is not anticipated to change or shift depending upon what the particular decision is. So incompetence is another definition, circumstance in which we would limit autonomy to help support someone's health. I'm not going to talk about those other two. We'll focus on grave disability, but just to give you a sense that we tend to be very careful when we're limiting autonomy. That does tend to be our priority. There are relatively common circumstances in which, in mental health, we sometimes do need to limit an individual's right to choose for him or herself in order to protect and to provide good care. And these are, I've just listed a few sort of prototypic examples where we, as mental health providers, sometimes relying on the LPS Act, will limit autonomy. So active suicidality, someone is actively saying, I want to die. Our role there is not to prioritize their autonomy or what they want in that moment, but to protect them. And that's why we have legal structures in place to do that. Similarly, an acute and immediate plan to hurt someone else, to kill someone else. That's a circumstance in which we, rather than going along with that person's will and choice and their own self-determination, we would limit their autonomy to keep others safe. And when we're dealing with individuals with a psychotic disorder, we also encounter some circumstances where a mental illness itself, the symptoms of a mental illness, might mean that we will not value temporarily that individual's autonomy. We will do something to protect that person or others. So if an individual is delusional, they have a fixed false belief and they're ready to act on it, and it might be a belief, for instance, a delusion that someone else must die. There may be a delusion that there will be aliens who are coming to invade, but if this one individual could be killed, that would save all of us from the invasion. So that's a delusional belief. It would compel an individual to try to act and to hurt someone else. So that's a circumstance where we limit autonomy. And those are the kinds of circumstances, particularly around delusions, that we're going to talk about as we move into a dialogue about grave disability. And I want to pause here, and I can move back. We can look again at any other slides, but I want to pause for a moment and see if we have questions, comments, thoughts about anything that I've presented so far. Take a look at the chat as well. If there are any questions you want to pose in the chat, and I'll look for any hands going up. Anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question? Particularly anything that was not perfectly clear you'd like me to return to. Looks like we're okay to continue, so I'll proceed. So again, returning to this definition, I really do encourage people to memorize this definition. It is the foundation of how I think about assessing grave disability, and I'll show you that. Now, what we often hear, I hear this in the ER, I hear this from clinicians, I hear this from people talking in a casual way about grave disability. We often hear some definitions of grave disability that are not accurate, that may get at a piece of what grave disability is, but not the whole picture. And there's a set of them that are about someone who is kind of doing okay, and so therefore must not be gravely disabled. And again, that isn't an accurate definition, but you do hear this. This individual can't be gravely disabled because they're eating and they're drinking. This person can't be gravely disabled because I'm engaged with him. He's listening to me. He trusts me. He's engaged, so he can't be gravely disabled. Neither of those are an accurate description of grave disability. We hear a lot in the ER someone who might be thinking of discharging someone who's unsheltered. He's not gravely disabled because he has a plan to get home. He knows how to get on the bus, he knows where he's going to go, and he has an ability to survive on the streets. He's been on the streets for so long. He knows how to survive, and therefore he must not be gravely disabled. Those as well are really not definitions or determinations of grave disability. They're a piece of something that might be an assessment that's important, but they're not the whole picture. And then the third thing we commonly hear are these statements at the end. The ER would never admit him to psychiatry. If I put him on a hold and I get him to the ER, well, they're not going to admit him. There's no bed for him. There's no place for him to be, or I can't get the police to help me to move him to safety. These are markers of system limitations, system challenges, and they often will prevent us from making a determination of grave disability, and they should not. We should try to set to the side the system limitations, the resource limitations, and think of the circumstance outside of those, make our own decision about whether grave disability is present. We can then separately ask what needs to be done about it. But unfortunately, because the system resources are often not there, we've gotten out of the habit of making the determination of really understanding what we think is going on. And I think that process is extremely important. And I'm very pleased to share this with you because I think these are the sorts of things that the clinicians and all the providers that you work with sometimes need a reminder of. These are the sorts of things that we're emphasizing in these trainings to help people really make the determination outside of what resource issues they might confront once they understand the challenge, with the knowledge that we're getting there. We're trying to find opportunities for improve what's available for people with grave disability. So when I teach people about evaluating grave disability, I break it into these two parts: interpreting motives and assessing abilities. And these two parts of my evaluation are really built directly on the statute, directly on the definition of grave disability from the LPS Act. As a result of a mental disorder is that aspect of interpreting motives, and is unable to provide for his or her basic personal needs is that aspect of assessing abilities. And so I will evaluate in these two different steps, and I will show you what each of them might mean. First, I'll interpret motives, and second, I will assess abilities. And if I feel both of those are consistent with grave disability, then I can feel confident about the determination. So I'll talk first about interpreting motives because it is sometimes the most complicated part of evaluating grave disability. And interpreting motives simply means that as a result of a mental disorder, this individual is in the situation that they're in. As a result of, caused by their mental illness, due to their mental illness. Often what that means is there's a symptom of their mental illness that is shaping what they're doing right now. So symptoms of mental disorders that can shape behavior could be delusions, could be hallucinations, hearing voices, hearing commands, for instance. Anhedonia, where someone is not feeling any pleasure, they're not able to feel any anticipatory pleasure, anything they're excited to do, completely without a desire. Sometimes anhedonia is one of those symptoms of a mental disorder that's strongly shaping someone's behavior. Amotivation, that is one of those symptoms that we can see in psychotic disorders, where an individual, as a result of their mental illness, they have high degrees of amotivation, where they really simply they don't move, they don't seek anything out. They sometimes will not take up suggestions because of their very severe amotivation. Of course, agitation is a symptom that drives behavior as well, and so forth. So these are examples where symptoms of a mental illness are driving someone's behavior. And that's what I mean by motivation. So what is it that's underlying their behavior? And if it's a symptom of a mental disorder, you're within the realm of something indicated by the Grave Disability Statute. One of the things that I emphasize for clinicians is what the diagnosis is not important. You may not know, and it can often take a long, long time to understand what the diagnosis for that individual might be. And so we go with our best guess of what's happening. And there are times where we, in an urgent setting, we might believe someone is gravely disabled. We might believe it's because of a mental illness, but it turns out once they're evaluated that there are other factors, other causes, an intellectual disability, traumatic brain injury, substance-induced condition, dementia, and so forth. These are diagnoses, particularly cognitive impairment, dementia. They're not technically covered under the LPS Act. Those are not circumstances in which you would put someone on a hold. But for urgent situations, if you don't know the diagnosis, you use your best guess that this is a mental illness. And in that circumstance, a hold, for instance, for GD will make sense, even if the diagnosis turns out to be different down the road. Just some examples here. It's always very interesting to hear from folks in trainings of examples that they have encountered where symptoms are shaping behavior. Delusions are really the symptom we're most commonly seeing among individuals who are unsheltered. False beliefs that don't change. You can't persuade someone out of them, no matter what evidence you have. And things like being persecuted, being harassed, communicating with celebrities, being on a mission, that there are people doing things to one's body, completely imaginary and not true, that one's identity has been switched. These are delusions, and they can shape very unusual behaviors. Hallucinations, of course, are sometimes just voices. Sometimes they comment on what someone is eating or doing. They might talk to them in a running way about the kinds of things that they're doing, mundane things. Other times, though, those hallucinations can say things that are dangerous. Walk through that bus, hit that man, run at that, go away now, move your arm. These are things that, that the individual may be hearing day in and day out, and maybe resisting it almost all of the time. But it's that time, that circumstance in which they're not able to resist that hallucination. Those are the ones that we worry about, that someone may, in fact, feel compelled. Ultimately, after fighting it back and ignoring it for a long period of time, they may feel compelled to walk in front of a bus, for instance, in response to a hallucination. I'm going to stop here and check about a question in the, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Wonderful. Is it common to see hallucinations, anhedonia, and amotivation and agitation in a single individual? An individual, for instance, with autism and schizophrenia? Great question. Hallucinations and delusions are really the most common symptoms of a psychotic disorder. Schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, hallucinations and delusions tend to let you know someone has a psychotic disorder. Those are the definition of psychosis. And you don't always see both together. Sometimes individuals with a psychotic disorder with schizophrenia, they may have just delusions, no hallucinations. Other people may have no delusions, but they do have hallucinations. So often we get used to asking people if they're hearing any voices, and many people who are have a false belief, have a delusional belief, they will say, I don't hear any voices, but you will get a feel that they have some other false beliefs. Anhedonia is primarily a symptom of very severe depression. Of course, people could have depression and psychosis. They could have schizoaffective disorder, where someone can become very depressed and also have psychosis, delusions or hallucinations. But anhedonia is typically most concerning where it's a part of very severe depression itself. And agitation can be a symptom experienced from a variety of things. Sometimes it can be driven by psychotic thoughts, delusions, or hallucinations. Other times it can be an affective thought. Someone feels so energetic, very elevated, and they can become agitated in that context. So they sometimes go together. We tend to prioritize some or another. Yeah, I have a concerned client with drug-seeking behavior. Stage 2 wants a less confined facility so that she can use. How do you categorize someone like this? This is an excellent question. Really interesting implications here. So let's take the kind of prototypic example of an individual with a substance use disorder, someone who's had developed tolerance, dependence on a certain substance, and what they're experiencing is a craving. They want to use more of that substance. They don't want to be sober. And so they're looking for a setting where they can use. And that really is outside of the issue of, are they having symptoms that are driving their behavior? That's a circumstance where you're thinking about their safety. Do they know how to keep themselves safe? It doesn't actually count as one of those symptoms. The cravings itself doesn't really count as one of those symptoms that we think of as symptoms that are driving grave disability. Now, other times, people can have delusional beliefs that come out for you as, I want to use, or that's the story that they're telling you. But there may be other things to it. Certainly very common that I hear from people, they think of themselves in a certain way as someone who would use, but it actually turns out they're not using at all. There can be some underlying false beliefs that are expressed in this, and that does give you a feel for how much delusional thoughts can inform behavior. We can circle back to these and get some more details, as I may or may not have answered the question that you have. But let me take this other question here. Is there a specific legal definition of mental disorder as opposed to dementia, substance use, or other reasons? Yes, it does need to be a mental disorder. So what the courts would look at is sort of what is the diagnostic and statistical manual, for instance, what are the definitions clinically used around mental disorders presently. So it's not in the statute itself, but the court, my sense, and there may be others who have a better clarity about this, but they would look to see what is the current definition of a mental disorder that would count in the present context for this individual. But again, it doesn't need to be the right disorder, that this is depression versus schizophrenia. But your question also is there a disorder, for instance, a substance use disorder that could count under this statute? So the grave disability mental disorder could be a substance use disorder and nothing else, primary substance use disorder. That's a legal question. I'm reluctant to wade into that, but my sense is there actually is just simply legal precedent convention that we don't use grave disability in a circumstance of primary substance use. There are some other statutes that are relevant to primary substance use. My understanding is in most counties in California, those statutes are not widely used. They might not be widely accepted within different counties, either by the court or by offices who are overseeing petitions. It isn't that there are options for someone with only a primary substance use to be mandated to treatment. They're just not commonly used. And for an LPS conservatorship, that is not an acceptable standard. There does tend to need to be a mental disorder that is not only a substance use disorder. It would be a psychotic disorder. It would be a mood disorder, for instance. Those are the ones that are recognized by the court for the LPS process. Excuse me. I wanted to mark a little bit of the complexity that comes up when we start to question, is this symptom driving behavior? People, particularly who are delusional, they may be very guarded. They may say very little. They may be afraid to share with you. You sometimes will see behaviors that you think must surely be driven by psychosis, even if the individual is not telling you that explicitly. And I'm going to tell you about a case of Hector, imaginary vignette of an individual named Hector who's living on the streets and is having a very hard time coming indoors, very hard time staying at a hotel, staying in the hospital, even when there are medical needs. And it turns out that Hector believes that his heart was removed 20 years ago, and that he's been carrying around in his backpack a solar-powered heart. This is discovered incidentally in the course of working with him, but this is a fixed delusion for him. And what the team notices first is that he's leaving the hospital, he's leaving the hotel. You place him, but he can't stay there very long. And unfortunately, Hector is not going to explicitly come out and tell us. And I'll go back through the example of Hector and say a bit more about it in just a minute. So these are some of the questions that I tend to think about when I'm wondering about, again, we're on that first step of interpreting motives. What is it that's driving the person's behavior? Is it a symptom that's driving their behavior? Are there ideas that are driving their behavior? I have a solar-powered heart in my backpack. And if I'm indoors too long, my solar-powered heart might stop. So it's an idea that might drive Hector's behavior. Is that idea reality-based? Is that something that is shared by all of us, or is that a delusional idea? What is it that's motivating the individual to behave as they are, but also can they choose other ways to behave? So it's one thing to have a motivation for what we're doing, but if an individual is so inflexible they couldn't choose another way to behave, that's where you start to worry. That kind of rigidity can be a red flag. Sometimes you see behaviors that seem so bizarre, you really can't understand what the rationale is. An individual is painting themselves with peanut butter, or they're doing certain things to their shoes or their clothes. They only take or drink certain colored drinks. And you just can't imagine what might be going on for that individual. And that might be a circumstance where you think, is this a mental illness that is driving this kind of behavior? Okay. I'm going to pause here and get your thoughts or input both about these questions, any circumstances that these raise to you, thoughts that you have about how this does or doesn't apply in your work. And also I'm noticing the questions in the chat as well, and we could begin to sort these through. Wonderful. For the purpose of this part, serious mental disorder that is severe in degree and persistent in duration, which may cause behavioral functioning which interferes substantially with the primary activities of daily living, which may result in an inability to maintain stable adjustment and independent functioning without treatment, support, and rehabilitation for a long or indefinite period of time. Serious mental disorders include, but are not limited to, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, major affective disorders, or other severely disabling mental disorders. Not be construed to exclude persons with a serious mental disorder and a diagnosis of substance use, developmental disability, or other physical or mental health disorders. Excellent. So, helpful context, not contradictory to the way we've been discussing this here. We think of a mental disorder in terms of the kinds of things that would require mental health treatment that have an impact on behavior and therefore on functioning, that impact daily activities. When we started to get into which are the disorders that count or don't count, that's where there's much more gray area. And in part, that's because these disorders are shifting historically. The way they're defined is shifting over time. what counts as criteria, for instance, and also their diagnosis can be contested. One psychiatrist might say this individual has autism and schizophrenia. Another mental health professional might say they have schizoaffective disorder and Asperger's, for instance, and not clear that one is right or wrong. So it's the constellation of the presence of mental disorder that's shaping behavior that is important. And it is true in San Diego and elsewhere, other counties as well. LPS concerned with OCD and autism does not need to be a psychotic disorder. Also could be a severe affective disorder, a mood disorder. Those are things that are considered holistically for an individual in general in the mental health court process. Thanks so much for those clarifications, really helpful for all of us. All right, any other questions, thoughts before we go forward? Okay. Okay, this sounds like a concept that makes a lot of sense, that there are symptoms that will drive behavior. I'm going to give you a few more examples of how this might impact someone's ability to care for themselves. This is that second part of evaluating grave disability that I focus on, that a person as a result of a mental disorder is unable to provide for his or her basic personal needs for food, clothing, or shelter. Unable to access is included in this too. Repeated failures to maintain is a way we think about this too. Unable to provide another synonyms for that sort of idea. So can my client provide for his or her basic personal needs for food, clothing, and shelter? Have you observed that the person is able to provide for their basic needs, food, clothing, or shelter? Sometimes shelter, the definition of shelter varies county by county, doesn't it? Sometimes clinically, what we look for and think about as shelter is that the individual, when it rains or when it gets very cold, they're able to provide something that seems like shelter. They may, for instance, have a tarp that they use. They may have a way to make that available to them. They may use a tent. We see that, of course, very commonly, but even something a little more makeshift that would count as protection against the elements is something that sometimes gets grouped into shelter. We get into much more complicated space when we begin to think of shelter as only a building, only indoors. For instance, if someone is saying, I won't go indoors, I'm not interested in any kind of indoor setting that you have, is that individual unable to provide for their shelter? Not so clear, right? And what counts as enough shelter? These are the sorts of things that become very complex in today's context with such a severe challenge of homelessness. But shelter is something needed for one's safety, and that's how we think about it. Food and clothing provided by the community. Does the person only survive with the help of others? They have food, but that's because there's a fleet of people each day that bring them food and things to drink. Community's feeding the person. That's a problem. We would raise the question, this person doesn't seem able to provide food or clothing for themselves. They rely on a set of folks who are not reliable. This is a circumstance that could pose serious challenges to the individual. Now, in and of itself, being fed by the community is probably not enough to make a strong case for grave disability. But what we often see is that certain food or clothing, things to drink, are not acceptable. The person is not actually always or consistently accepting food and clothing that's brought to them. will that individual take whatever that you give, or does it often sit there for far too long and rot and become inedible? That's what we see quite commonly. And then you really begin to think this is someone fed by the community and they're not consistently able to accept assistance when the need arises. Do the symptoms prevent the individual from making use of your offers, including of housing? Or do they make it likely that those resources can't be sustained, won't be maintained by the individual? The symptom, again, is causing a circumstance where basic personal needs cannot be met. So let's say a little more about this. Just pause for a sec, see if we have any other questions or comments here. Okay, so here are some examples of an inability to provide for basic needs that we see. Each of these we see very commonly. As you can see, they are focused on individuals who are unsheltered, but these are the sorts of things that we might notice in other circumstances too, in someone who's housed. In an unsheltered population, you will sometimes see someone who is urinating or defecating right at their spot, and they may keep it nearby to them. They may have a bottle that they use to urinate in. They may have feces that are around their spot, and they often keep it close to them without any concern about safety or hygiene in that setting. That is a thing that we see. And you can imagine if an individual is very paranoid, they have a delusion, perhaps they're being watched or followed or hunted or persecuted against, it would feel very unsafe to use an indoor restroom, for instance, or to rely on the businesses nearby for a restroom, or even to leave your spot to defecate or to urinate. So that is a concern when we see that. Also, of course, we sometimes see people who are not able to utilize clothing in a way we would expect. They're not wearing clothing the way you would anticipate or that would provide protection. We certainly see people sometimes with shoes on their feet, but the soles are cracked all the way open. So if the individual were to walk on the shoe, their foot would be on the ground. So it's a shoe, but in name only, it's not actually protecting the foot itself. So that is not an appropriate use of clothing. Another example we would see of a lack of ability here. Being in one spot for a long, long period of time, years, right? We see this, someone sitting on a bus bench, on a corner, really in one spot. Makes you think of a couple of things right away. One is amotivation, that issue that I talked about with psychotic disorders of a lack of motivation can sometimes be what is keeping that individual in one spot for a long, long period of time in a way that is unusual, bizarre, concerning, suspect. It's not very natural or very easy for most people to be in one spot for a long, long period of time. So in addition to amotivation, and we've seen examples here too, very common thing is people will develop a delusion that references the spot that they're in. They may believe they have a mission in that one spot. I've been placed here by the CIA to surveil this corner, to keep track of the safety of this particular spot. I cannot move from this spot. It's another motivation, sometimes for being in one spot for a long, long period of time. But in that one spot, one cannot provide very well for their food, clothing, and shelter, any other personal needs that they have. We certainly, of course, see medical conditions that arise in this context. We can talk about this too, this issue of if someone has an urgent medical need, is that a criteria for grave disability? How does that shape your grave disability determination? Essentially, it's a piece of, are they able to provide for their basic safety? It's not food, clothing, or shelter, but basic safety. Someone has a large infected wound, very dangerous to their health, and they're oblivious to it. There's nothing wrong with my legs. There's nothing going on here in my foot. It's getting better. It's being healed, and you can see objectively that is not the case. That's a marker of an inability to provide for one's safety. Okay. I just want to make a point about each of these in and of themselves are just a marker, a piece of a case. So covered in feces or other substances, paint, an individual who might use paint to cover him or herself. There are times, particularly in unsheltered settings, where there is a rational idea to use repulsive materials on your body to keep others away. And that can be for safety. If I were unapproachable, repulsive, smelled so bad, others would leave me alone, that can be a very rational thought, right? In and of itself, we don't know what the motivation is. There can be delusional reasons too that an individual might do that. But each of these could have another explanation that is not delusional, that is not due to a mental illness. But each of these really are concerning enough that we would want to wonder what the motivation is. So here's just some other examples, and they relate to accepting shelter. Behaviors or symptoms caused by mental illness that impact meeting basic needs. So an individual has a delusional belief they were to sign a housing application, they would be arrested. And I don't just mean general suspicion, but a clear delusional idea that this signature would signify arrest. As I mentioned, a mission to be in a particular place, to do something in one particular location, that's so important that that person cannot leave. An individual who left a board and care, was previously housed, but needed to leave because that individual uncovered the fact that the staff were meeting in seances to select a resident to torture. The board and care itself became, for delusional reasons, unsafe for that person. They needed to leave and would not go back. Good examples of the kinds of things where we would think about grave disability. Very, very common that food or clothing brought by others needs to be approved. We see this regularly. Some delusional presence, a force, an entity that before that individual can take the new shoes that you brought for him, he needs to see that others are okay with it or can approve it. It's a surprisingly common experience. So again, sort of being fed by the community is one thing, but you need to see that the individual can actually take advantage of those items for their own safety. Okay. Thoughts, comments, any observations about these kinds of circumstances? Okay, 3 more examples here. Real world examples. An individual on a bus bench for a long, long period of time, believing that the uniformed personnel walking along the busy streets actually were prison guards, and that individual had to stay on that bus bench because if he were to stand up, he'd be executed. He's in jail, actually, on that bus bench, is the delusional belief. If I get up, they will execute me. Security guard walking around, maybe a police officer walking back to headquarters. But in the belief, those are individuals who are ready to execute the individual if he were to get up from that bus bench. Perfect example of a grave disability circumstance, a delusion that is making it impossible for that individual to access food, clothing, shelter, or any other basic personal needs. I've mentioned to you Hector, solar-powered heart that needs to be charged outdoors, so it makes it impossible to come in. I can't go to a shelter because they're run by the KGB, who implant chips in your head. If I were to go inside, they would implant something in my body, and that would not be safe. One of the things that characterizes delusions is that they are unique to the individual. So we could talk about conspiracy theories. In the news today, a lot of ideas about conspiratorial things that are not real, that may be supported by misinformation. Those are different than delusions in the sense that delusions are extremely specific and unique to the individual. You really don't encounter two delusions that are the same, one person to the next. Sometimes we talk about them as bizarre and unusual. It's just because they're very idiosyncratic, very particular to the person, always have a unique flavor to them. So while you can see any number of common themes here, themes about control, themes about being oppressed, themes about surveillance, themes about the government, themes about being under the thumb of others. These are very common kinds of things. Being having an important purpose, common thing that comes up in delusions, but those themes get elaborated in really unique ways by each individual person. And part of the problem is the individual experiencing the delusion basically never tells us explicitly what's going on. It's a story that we often have to piece together over a long period of time. So Hector, with his solar-powered heart, if I go to speak to Hector, I've heard that he hinted at this to someone else, and I want to go talk to Hector about this idea that he carries a heart in his backpack and that his heart was removed decades ago by surgeons. I want to hear from Hector about this issue. Unfortunately, what will never happen with Hector, he will never say, you may be right. It's not likely that I have a solar-powered heart. It's true that had the doctors removed my heart 20 years ago, I wouldn't be here today. I won't be able to talk Hector out of the idea, or even to have him string together a couple of sentences like this, where he's pretending to have been talked out of the idea. Nor will Hector really clarify for me exactly how that delusion is shaping his behavior. He will not say to me, yes, I believe my heart was removed and I have a solar-powered heart. And if I live inside for more than 3 days, I will die. My heart needs sun every day to work. I don't need to take my heart medications because I have a machine instead. If I take these medications along with some water, my heart will stop. Hector will not lay out the kinds of choices he's making that are shaped by his delusion of a solar-powered heart. This is what makes this work so difficult, is that individual who believes himself to be in jail and at risk of execution sitting on a bus bench, he just won't lay that all out for me or anyone else speaking with him. Take some time to piece it together. We can get validation from that individual. Once we have an idea, we can propose it and see if that individual agrees. But the individual will rarely lay it out for you in a way that is linear. So this is a little cartoon we made, again, about an imaginary person we call Hector. If I'm going to speak with Hector, try to understand what might be making it hard for him to stay indoors. I know he has this idea that I've heard from someone else about his solar-powered heart. Wonder if you could tell me what's going on with your heart, Hector. Doing great, Hector says to me. No emotion on his face. Next, I try to validate how distressing it may be to feel that your heart has been removed and that you need to carry a machine with you instead. Gosh, I heard that you'd had your heart removed. How awful. That must have been very scary. Long time ago, can't say more. He's not going to elaborate for me about this delusion. Hector, I am worried about the swelling in your legs. I know this may have to do with his actual true heart disease. I'm worried about it. I wonder if we should see the doctors again. That's not necessary. I don't need that. My legs are fine. This is the most common scenario with someone who is actively delusional. This is how the conversation may go. And unfortunately, when that arises, we are left piecing together disparate pieces of information to help us fundamentally take a best guess about what it is that would drive particular kinds of behaviors, looking at the pattern of the behaviors and how they fit together. That's most common in individuals with grave disability. Puts a good deal of burden on those of us who are able to work with an individual over time and get small pieces of information a little bit at a time. But that is most common. That's the nature of a psychotic illness. Truthfully, that is the case for someone living on the street, the case for someone on treatment often as well. Really has nothing to do with a particular phase of the illness. It's just on how delusions can get discussed and managed. Okay. Questions, observations about any of that? I'll pause again. We'll see if we have some issues that folks would like to bring up about what I've just mentioned. And you can unmute yourself. You can use the chat. Any questions or issues coming up for you? Okay. Very good. Oh. All right. I'm going to talk a little about the kinds of things that we look for when we're acutely evaluating for this second issue of attending to one's needs. Really, in the absence of very specific explanation of delusional thinking, we do rely on our ability to observe, to listen, and to listen very patiently, to simply be present with an individual, to raise some questions, but to do so very gently, and to learn through collaterals. You all know all of this very well through your work, how important it is to learn from collaterals, and also to do careful observation over time of how well someone is able to take care of their physical body, how their behavior is in context, where they are, how it is that they manage those around them. The difference in working with someone who is very impaired as a result of their symptoms and someone else, often the difference is we spend a lot more time just listening. Much of outreach, for instance, if we were to think about outreach, clinical work is just the same way. We tend to come with very structured questions. How are you doing? Would you like a coffee? Could I bring you something to eat? Can I talk to you today? For an individual experiencing psychosis, questions like that can feel scary, intrusive. They can feel like a demand. They can feel frightening. They can feel risky. The individual may not know what the stakes are of answering the question. So it can feel like a demand, right? Would you like some coffee? If I'm a person who is experiencing a lot of thoughts and a lot of thoughts that are quite elaborate, that question may not be best. I do spend a lot of time sitting, often without explicitly asking for permission. I introduce myself, I'll go and I'll sit, and I'll wait and see what happens. So it's that ability to shift toward a mode of not making demand of the individual that can be important to teach, hard to teach around an individual who is experiencing psychosis. The other thing that's very important that we all get very used to is that an individual who is feeling paranoid, very scared of things that may be imaginary, right? Not really happening. We're actually in a safe circumstance, but that individual has a paranoid delusion. Fear is contagious. Someone's feeling nervous. I'm going to start to feel nervous, right? Someone starts to think they're being threatened. I might start to feel anxious about that. It's actually coming from the individual, not from the circumstance around us. And if we, as interviewers, become nervous and anxious and scared in relating to someone who is paranoid, that makes their paranoia worse. So one thing that's very important is to center ourselves and assure ourselves we will not feel fear in the context of working with someone who has a paranoid delusion, so that we can effectively avoid being enrolled into their fearful experience of the world. Once we are enrolled into their fearful experience, it's very hard to move back to a space where they feel comfortable enough letting us in, answering a question, being available for them. So that's what we talk about. Staying calm is a word for it, but essentially it just means if you're speaking with someone who's distressed or anxious or nervous about imaginary things, it's very natural to feel afraid. And so we just notice that and we stop and we remind ourselves those are not real things. And that kind of quiet persistence is the best way to allow someone who is psychotic to open up. Okay. Very nice question in the chat. I often hear people talk about symptoms of mental illness being involuntary, but when someone acts out in a destructive way, that people describe it as an intentional choice, suggesting that it's not caused by the mental illness. Can symptoms of mental illness be manifested as intentional behaviors? Let's unpack this a little bit. Where does intentionality come in to this? So how do we evaluate? How does intentionality change how we understand what is happening for a person? Such a fundamental dilemma beyond the issue of mental illness, beyond the issue of how our laws are organized around mental illness. It is the case. We do have strong societal pressures, beliefs, moral judgments around intentionality, around the difference between someone who is mad versus bad. That's sort of the classic descriptor of this, a difference in moral judgments. Do we think this person is ill, has an illness that is causing their behavior, in which case they are not responsible for it, versus do we think they are doing this themselves and they could change it? Just the fundament of so much of how we understand and adjudicate and make value judgments and consider these illnesses. I think one of the things very helpful for us all to do as mental health professionals situated in different spaces is to acknowledge that intentionality is really very hard to determine. We as outsiders are not going to be very good judges of whether someone is able to control it, quote unquote, wants to do it, could stop it, could change it. We're just poor observers of that. We're poorly able to really decipher that. Intentionality is complicated. We all do things for unconscious reasons, right? We all find ourselves doing things without having consciously thought of it. And trying to get to the bottom of that really kind of sets us down on a road that may not be very helpful. So how do we get out of this? I think one way is to begin to question how this comes up. A circumstance I think about often is that we see in the ER frequently people who bounce from one ER to the next. They might come to, one ER in the morning and another one in the evening, and then a couple of days later they come to another ER and they're looking for help, and they're clearly suffering. They may be living on the street. They may be barely able to take care of their basic needs, keep coming to ERs, and we get clinically we get tired of this. We think this person could stop. Can't they make another choice? Couldn't they go find an outpatient clinic? Couldn't they just go ahead and move indoors, access some of the services offered to them? And so it begins to feel intentional, begins to feel they're doing something to us. They're doing this on purpose to us to make our lives difficult. And it's just good to notice when we begin to think, this person's doing this thing to me. It's actually quite unlikely. They're probably doing it for their own reasons they may not be able to decipher, they may not be able to control it. So intentionality is more a marker for us when we start to think about intentionality and we start to suspect someone's needs or behaviors or motivations. We should understand that to be something going on in us as providers, something that, I may be annoyed, overworked, stressed about this. I feel frustrated because I can't provide this person with what I know them to need. So these are things going on in us, but we begin to judge what that other person might be able to control instead. So I think intentionality is a good thing to try to move out of the way and to observe instead particular behaviors, the presence of particular symptoms that let us know that an illness is there. And to get better, not an easy thing to do, at looking inside when we're working with people with complex circumstances and ask ourselves what's going on for us. Okay. I'm going to just move forward a little bit more because there's a hot button question in the chat at this point, which I will speak to, but I'm going to get through a couple more slides before I work on that with you. Oh, just another slide here around obvious things that we look for. Again, observable characteristics, often very, very helpful around behavior context. These are particularly things with someone who's experiencing homelessness that we would focus on. Okay, just a little bit of the kinds of things I think about when I think about collaterals. You all may have a longer list here, other things that you do, but things that I want to know if I have someone who appears to be gravely disabled. I want to understand, of course, how often they've been hospitalized, how many times they've been 5150'd, have they ever been referred to AOT, have they been conserved before, have they been in an FSP program or another kind of assertive inpatient or outpatient treatment program? Do they have justice involvement? Do they have regional center involvement? Are there medical diagnoses that may be relevant here? What are the people around them telling me about how they care for themselves, how they buy food or use food? Again, where they use restroom facilities, how they connect with others, how they behave when I'm not here. These are kinds of collateral things that I try to decipher when I'm working to evaluate someone. We also frequently look for changes, big changes, or no changes. Again, this is relevant for someone living on the street, but also relevant for anyone else you're working with. Big changes like losing a lot of weight in a short period of time, changing one's behavior very radically in a short period of time. I've mentioned to you the no changes marker as well as something that someone's safety is compromised, staying in one place for months, not moving one's body, not changing clothes. And again, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. And this is what I use as a slide for a clinician who's working on a team and they think that their client might be gravely disabled. It does not mean that that individual needs to be placed on a hold immediately and put into the hospital. You make the determination and then you figure out together with others around you what you do about it to advance someone's safety. First of all, you discuss it with others, you deliberate with others. You might look at this aspect of what are the motivations, what are the symptoms, what might be driving this person's behavior, and are they able to provide for personal needs? You look at their history, you explore medications. You explore what might be possible to do with medications, even ones that might just be a start, very low dose. But if there's any openness to medications to begin, think about that. And you map out a plan. If we do need to move to a hospitalization, to an ER visit, how are we going to do that? Who are the partners we need at the table? What are the referrals that might be helpful here? These are the sorts of things that can be very important when there's a determination or a question of the determination, that's when the process starts to begin to consider what else will we need here? What are the possibilities? Where might this end? What's the trajectory that would make sense here? Okay. Okay, let's go to the chat. This is essentially the end of the structured information I want to give for you. What are my thoughts on pending legislation to expand the definition of grave disability to include medical issues? In general, I am very aware, simply from having worked in a number of different contexts, that the implementation of a conservatorship intervention, the implementation, the use of how many people get access to an intervention of a conservatorship, it's unevenly distributed. It's inequitably distributed. We have certain people who are able to access that intervention. And it's an intervention like any other clinical intervention, a conservatorship. It's a clinical determination. There's a set of resources put in place around that individual as a result of that clinical determination. And the implementation, the use of that intervention is very unequal. Depends on what county you're in, depends on who you are, depends on where you're sitting, whether or not you can have the intervention of a conservatorship. And that to me is the fundamental problem. And when we know that interventions, effective interventions, are not implemented equitably, they worsen discrimination, they worsen disparities, they make the sickest people sicker, and they make slightly healthier people a little bit better because they get access to an intervention. So to me, the fundamental concern is about equity of implementation of an LPS conservatorship across the state, within a county, within a locality, within different service systems, but also across California. We don't know enough about who gets access to this intervention and under what circumstances. We don't know enough to know that it's used where it's needed, that it's not overused when it isn't needed. And that to me is the fundamental problem. I thankfully am not involved in trying to draft legislation or consider the pros and cons of different legislative approaches. I find that very complicated. But to me, whatever the change might be legislatively, if that implementation problem is still in place, we may not be helping the most vulnerable. We may be, in fact, having an intervention, an approach that isn't able to be used by those who could most benefit from it. And so I try to focus on that implementation issue and understand how we can make it higher quality and more consistent and more equitable. Okay, are folks able to hear me? Wonder if we had some had an audio problem, but maybe you can still hear me. Okay.
So good, Dr. Bromley.
Okay, great. What are your thoughts about the burden of proof for someone to get on versus renew their conservatorship? Beyond a reasonable doubt. So very high bar, right? Do we think the bar could be a little bit lower? Again, to me, the fundamental issue is one of equity and how equitably across different players, across different settings, those criteria can be put into practice. And I think we just know enough to know that it's not ideal at this point. So there's a lot of work to do at that particular interactive point of who is it that's able to access this intervention. Okay, last questions. I'll keep going. Okay, evaluation of grave disability for someone actively incarcerated. They're receiving third-party support from the jail. This question is not just about jail. It's also about someone who is living in a context, structured context, a supported context, where they may be getting meals, for instance, at a boarding care. They may have someone who's already there providing them with food, clothing, too, sometimes, housekeeping, right? Medications. These are the things that individuals within a board and care structure. Maybe it's a lax setting as well. So the person has no choice. They're not choosing it on their own. So those are different, right? And this is really a decision for the judge. The judge makes that choice. And I've seen judges go in both directions. We can say as clinicians, this person's doing well because all of these supports are in place. If we take the conservatorship away, those supports will be gone. The person is telling us they will walk away from those supports and that person will be right where they started. And for some legal proceedings, that counts. That individual remains gravely disabled. There are other supports that are required to keep them safe. In other proceedings, that isn't how it goes. So we try to clarify what's going on for the individual, what the individual has demonstrated they can do in terms of self-care and safety, and try to differentiate that from the things that are provided in the context that they're in, since we can't be assured that context will be available long-term. Okay. What do you look at or look for when determining what is considered the primary diagnosis? Great question. Someone has a substance use disorder, personality disorder, also determined to have a psychiatric condition. How do you determine if the psychiatric condition is primary or if it's something else? Key issue, two key things to say about this. Substance use, we are very bad in the moment at differentiating a primary psychotic disorder from a substance-induced psychotic disorder. They look just the same. Someone's substance-induced disorder can be exactly in appearance the same as someone without any substance use who has a psychotic disorder. However, once we move that individual into a controlled setting, like a hospital, it doesn't take too long for the difference to become quite clear, that the individual is able to care for themselves. They are able to manage their self-care when they're not using substances. It becomes very quickly clear if it's a substance-induced disorder. So that's sometimes the role of a 5150. You may not know, you can't tell. It looks like it's probably a primary disorder, but until I have this person in a controlled setting, I can't tell what's really going on. That's an excellent use of, in my opinion, of a 5150 for someone who looks gravely disabled. I don't know anything about this person. I can't tell. Is this substances? Is this a medical illness? Are they delirious? Is it just depression? Are they hungry and they're not able to eat? Let me evaluate them in a controlled setting where we can really differentiate those different variables. Personality disorder is a similar kind of thing. Personality disorder, psychotic disorder, if it's impacting someone's functioning to a severe degree, those are both valid diagnoses, both valid reasons to determine that someone is gravely disabled. Depends on their functioning and their safety. Okay. What are your thoughts on the case law saying that GD definition is not unconstitutionally vague and overbroad? I'm not going to speak to any specific circumstances you might be knowing of. My view, and I hope I've tried to make this clear, my view is that the GD criteria as they're written are interpretable and actionable. And they do capture the key issues we really worry about. They differentiate an individual whose safety is compromised by reasons other than symptoms of their mental illness. And they do distinguish that group who's experiencing symptoms that are shaping their behaviors. It's not easy to interpret it. And often in a team or a group of people, you may have different views. You may not have everyone agreeing. Now they definitely meet criteria. No, I don't think so quite yet. You may have differing views, but that deliberation to me is not a downside. That is fine. That is the nature of clinical work with people with complex disorders. So I find the statute as is written now in this way, interpretable, clinically understandable, comprehensible, and also one that might elicit a lot of different views over time, but can be a nice way to center what a whole team is thinking about with regard to an individual. Okay, number of technical questions as well that follow here. Wonderful. Oh, I love this. Thank you so much for these other views, points of view, very helpful to me. Court found the Department of Corrections Rehabilitation not within the scope of the safety net envisioned to qualify as third-party assistance, cannot reasonably be found to provide the same type of volitional altruistic care which family or friends can supply. It's actually one of the reasons I connect with a grave disability definition as it is. It's a clinical definition. It includes a good deal of expert clinical point of view. It's consistent with how, as a psychiatrist, I think about what's going on for my clients. So this is an interesting reference that, in fact, sort of legally as well, this is understood to be a medical issue. This is an issue that is a clinical one where psychiatrists are trained to evaluate. That makes sense to me. And I think it's true. There's a number of things around the structure of medicine that prepare, I think, psychiatrists and other mental health professionals to evaluate in this way.
Dr. Bromley, looks like we have one more question in the chat, and then we will conclude for the day. From Leah.
Yeah, I think, Leah, it's this one. Do your bench officers heavily weigh third-party assistance, especially when it comes to ineffective third-party assistance under conservatorship? We have to fight hard to show that a friend cannot keep the conservator safe, even though they may have a plan. Yes, that is the case here as well. That's been our experience. We need to demonstrate, for instance, that the individual may have articulated this plan before, but we observed that they weren't able to follow through. And there are now hearsay concerns too. So it needs to be something that's actually been observed by the person who, or heard directly by the person who's going to testify, that individual may say they have a plan, but we've seen this evidence that they're not able to follow through with it. One way this has been discussed is that there is a lifestyle. We hear this word lifestyle, like a choice. Is it a lifestyle? Well, it's a choice imposed by the illness. This is a lifestyle imposed by the illness. That is a way to think about it that I think might speak to this question of, well, is this person choosing this or not? Well, no, it's imposed by the illness, and that's what's distinct about GB. That's how I think about it. I hope that is helpful. Thank you for these terrific, wonderful questions. I've learned a lot from this, so I'm grateful. Hard to create the nexus between illness and lifestyle. Historical course, excellent. Historical examples, what you've seen this person do before. Best way to go, yeah. Oh, goodness, we're out of time, and I wanted to show you that there is a learning management system. I'm gonna put up the channel page, learn.